Picture this, December 3rd, 1945. HMS Ocean, pitching in the cold Atlantic swells off the English coast. On deck, sailors huddle against the spray, watching something that's never been done before. A jet aircraft is about to attempt the impossible, landing on a moving aircraft carrier. Captain Eric Winkle Brown circles above in a modified de Havilland Vampire. He's already the most experienced carrier pilot in the world, with over 2,400 deck landings. But this is different. Every aviation expert says jet engines are too powerful, too unresponsive for carrier operations. The throttle lag alone could kill him. Too much power on approach and he'll overshoot. Too little and he'll drop into the sea. Brown would later recall in his autobiography, "The Vampire's smooth acceleration and docile handling were precisely what I needed. But one miscalculation with that Goblin engine and I'd be swimming." He lines up his approach, the deck crew holds their breath, and in that moment, everything we thought we knew about naval aviation is about to change. This is the story of the de Havilland Vampire, the strange-looking jet that didn't just prove the experts wrong, it rewrote the rulebook for an entire generation of aircraft. By 1942, Britain was fighting for survival. Every factory, every worker, every scrap of aluminum was dedicated to building Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters. The last thing anyone wanted was an experimental jet fighter that might not even work. But de Havilland chief designer Ronald Bishop saw something others didn't. While Frank Whittle was developing Britain's revolutionary jet engine, Bishop understood that the engine itself was only half the problem. The real challenge was building an airframe around an engine that was shorter, hotter, and more temperamental than anything that had come before. The Goblin turbojet produced just over 3,000 pounds of thrust, compared to the 20,000 plus pounds modern fighters generate. But here's what made it tricky. That early jet engine needed the shortest possible jet pipe to maximize thrust and minimize power loss from friction and turbulence. Every extra inch of pipe meant wasted energy. Bishop's solution was radical. Instead of a conventional fuselage, he designed a twin-boom layout. The pilot sat far forward in a streamlined egg-shaped nacelle, giving him unprecedented visibility. The jet engine mounted directly behind him with its short, efficient exhaust. And the twin booms stretched back to support the horizontal stabilizers between them, creating an incredibly stable platform. It looked bizarre, like someone had built half an airplane, then stuck two tails on it as an afterthought, but it worked. On September 20th, 1943, test pilot Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., son of the company's founder, took the prototype into the sky for the first time. The flight was smooth, though testing revealed some directional instability that was quickly corrected through tail modifications. The Air Ministry ordered 300 aircraft for the war effort. Then reality hit. De Havilland was already stretched thin building mosquito bombers. They simply didn't have the manufacturing capacity. English electric aircraft took over production, but wartime resource limitations meant only 6 Vampires were completed by VE Day. The Vampire missed World War II entirely. For many aircraft, that would have been the end of the story. But for the Vampire, the war ending was just the beginning. Peace didn't mean the RAF lost interest. Far from it. The Air Force recognized that piston engine fighters were obsolete. The question wasn't whether to adopt jets, but which jets to adopt. The Vampire competed against the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's other jet fighter that had actually seen combat in the final months of the war. The Meteor was faster in a straight line, but the Vampire had something more valuable. It was simpler to build, cheaper to operate, and significantly easier to fly. One RAF pilot who transitioned from Spitfires to Vampires in 1946 wrote in his log, "After the Spit's temperamental Merlin, the Vampire's Goblin is like driving an automobile. Smooth, predictable, almost boring in its reliability, which means I can focus on actually flying instead of nursing the engine." The RAF made it official. The Vampire would replace their wartime piston fighters, but the aircraft still had something to prove. The jet age was so new that nobody really understood what these machines could do. Every flight was an experiment. Every mission pushed boundaries. The record started falling almost immediately. The Vampire became the first RAF fighter to exceed 500 miles per hour in level flight. Not the most dramatic record perhaps, but psychologically important. The sound barrier was still 2 years away from being broken, and 500 miles per hour was a number that captured the public imagination. Then came Captain Eric Brown's carrier landing on December 3, 1945, the moment we opened with. That wasn't just a record, it was a revolution. Brown proved that jet aircraft could operate from carriers, which meant naval aviation had a future beyond propeller-driven aircraft. Brown later wrote, "The naysayers claimed jet engines had too much throttle lag for carrier work. What they didn't understand was that the Vampire's docile handling characteristics more than compensated. It was one of the easiest aircraft I ever landed on a deck, jet or otherwise." On June 8, 1946, the British public got their first look at the jet age. 6 Vampires participated in a flyover during the Victory Day celebrations in London. Thousands craned their necks to watch these strange twin-boom fighters scream overhead, representing Britain's technological leap into the future. In March 1948, test pilot John Cunningham, already famous as a night fighter ace, pushed a modified Mark I Vampire to a new world altitude record, 59,446 feet. At that altitude, more than 11 miles up, the sky turns dark purple and you can see the curvature of the Earth. Cunningham's pressure suit was primitive by modern standards, essentially an inflatable rubber suit that squeezed his body to prevent his blood from boiling in the thin atmosphere. From a declassified RAF report on the flight, Wing Commander Cunningham reported severe physiological stress above 55,000 feet, including vision narrowing and cognitive impairment. Despite this, he maintained control and established the record. The Vampire's handling remained stable throughout, even in air so thin the control surfaces barely responded. But the most audacious demonstration came in July 1948. 6 Vampires from No. 54 Squadron RAF prepared for something that had never been attempted: flying jet fighters across the Atlantic Ocean. This wasn't a publicity stunt. The United States was Britain's critical Cold War ally, and the Americans were skeptical of British jet technology. They had their own jet fighters, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star and Republic F-84 Thunderjet. Why would they need British aircraft? The answer proved that British jets were so reliable they could fly across an ocean in the hands of regular squadron pilots, not test pilots. The route went from Scotland to Iceland to Labrador to Canada. Early jets didn't have long range, so each leg required careful fuel management. One of the pilots, Flight Lieutenant D.J. Paddy Davies, kept detailed notes of the crossing. Hour 3 over the North Atlantic. Nothing but gray water below, gray clouds above. The Vampire's Goblin hummed steadily, instruments showing normal. But you're always aware this engine has never done this before. None of them have. If it quits, you're swimming in water cold enough to kill you in minutes. The Americans think we're mad. Maybe they're right. All 6 Vampires made it. Not only did they cross the Atlantic, but they then participated in the RAF's annual Goodwill Tour of Canada and the United States, flying demonstrations from coast to coast. American pilots who flew against them in mock combat came away impressed. The Vampire might not be the fastest jet, but it was nimble, reliable, and most importantly, it was available for export. Here's where the Vampire's story gets interesting in a way that's unique among military aircraft. This wasn't just a British success story. This was a global phenomenon. Over 3,200 Vampires were built in the United Kingdom. Another 1,000 plus were manufactured abroad under license. 32 different countries flew the Vampire. Some built their own, some bought them new, some acquired them secondhand as wealthier nations upgraded to newer jets. For many nations, the Vampire was their first jet aircraft, period. That's how important this aircraft was. It didn't just introduce air forces to jet power, it trained an entire generation of pilots in jet operations, jet tactics, and jet maintenance. Why the Vampire? Cost and simplicity. The twin-boom design looked weird, but it was actually easier to manufacture than conventional fighters. The airframe was straightforward. The Goblin engine was reliable. And critically for export customers, the Vampire was easy to maintain in the field without sophisticated facilities. Italy's Machi company built Vampires under license, designated the Vampire Mk-52A. France's Sud-Est Aviation produced their own version. Switzerland's Federal Aircraft Factory manufactured them for the Swiss Air Force. which would become the last Air Force in the world to fly the Vampire, not retiring the aircraft until 1990, a staggering 47 years after its first flight. Mexico's Air Force gave the Vampire perhaps its best nickname. Mexican pilots called it El Aguacate, the avocado, because of its bulbous shape. The nickname stuck in Latin America, where several countries operated Vampires. A Mexican pilot's memoir from the 1960s describes his first flight. We called her Aguacate because she looked fat and round like an avocado. But in the air, she moved like a dancer, light on the controls, forgiving of mistakes. For pilots trained on P-47 Thunderbolts, the Vampire felt like stepping from a truck into a sports car. But the global spread of the Vampire meant something else. It would inevitably face combat. And in the small wars and brush fire conflicts that defined the early Cold War, the Vampire proved itself again and again. The Vampire saw its first combat in 1948 during the Malayan Emergency, Britain's counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas. The aircraft was pressed into ground attack duties, and it performed superbly. Armed with 4 20mm cannons or carrying 500-pound bombs, but most commonly equipped with rockets and rocket pods, the Vampire could loiter over the jungle, waiting for targets to reveal themselves. The Goblin engine's fuel efficiency meant longer patrol times than many contemporary jets. An RAF pilot's operational report from Malaya, declassified in the 1980s. The Vampire's visibility is exceptional for ground attack. The forward cockpit placement gives clear views directly below, critical when your target is hiding under triple canopy jungle. Multiple times we caught insurgent columns that would have been invisible in a conventional fighter. But the strangest combat scenario came in 1955, in the skies over Egypt. This is where British engineering would literally fight itself. Egypt had purchased Vampires from Britain in the early 1950s. Israel had purchased Gloucester Meteors, also British-made. When tensions escalated into open conflict, Egyptian Vampires found themselves facing Israeli Meteors. The air combat was brief but intense. 2 Egyptian Vampires were shot down in dogfights with the faster, more powerful Meteors. But here's what the combat reports revealed. The Vampires gave better than expected. Their superior maneuverability at low speeds made them difficult targets. Several Israeli pilots reported being surprised by how agile the Vampire was in turning fights. One Israeli pilot, in a post-mission debrief that was declassified in 2003, "We expected an easy victory. The Meteor is superior in almost every performance metric, but the Vampire pilot who engaged me knew his aircraft's strengths. He kept forcing me into slow-speed turning fights where my speed advantage became a liability. I won eventually, but it was harder than briefed." After 1956, Egypt shifted the Vampire primarily to ground attack roles against Israeli forces during the Suez Crisis and subsequent border conflicts. The aircraft's ability to carry a meaningful bomb load while maintaining good low-speed handling made it effective for strike missions. In 1959, the Caribbean saw Vampire combat when Dominican Republic aircraft flew against Cuban revolutionary forces attempting amphibious landings. Details remained scarce. The Dominican government was never forthcoming about the conflict, but records confirm Vampires conducted both reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The Vampire's final significant combat came in 1965 during the Indo-Pakistani War. India's Air Force flew Vampires in ground support roles, attacking Pakistani positions and supply lines. But by 1965, the Vampire was thoroughly obsolete as a fighter. Pakistani F-86 Sabres, American-built jets that were nearly a generation newer, had little trouble when they encountered Vampires. An Indian Air Force assessment from 1966. The Vampire performed adequately in ground attack where its ordnance capacity and stability made it effective. However, encounters with PAF Sabres demonstrated conclusively that the Vampire's time as anything resembling air superiority aircraft has passed. Losses were significant when Vampires were caught without fighter escort. After 1965, most air forces began retiring their combat Vampires, though many continued flying them as trainers. The two-seat Vampire T-11 trainer variant was particularly beloved by air forces worldwide for transitioning propeller pilot to jets. Switzerland has a unique military tradition, neutral but heavily armed, isolated by mountains but obsessively prepared. When the Swiss Air Force acquired Vampires in the early 1950s, they didn't just buy them, they studied them, improved them, and integrated them into one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in Europe. The Swiss built Vampires under license at their Federal Aircraft Factory. They modified them for alpine operations, which meant different engine tuning for high-altitude performance and reinforced landing gear for operations from mountain airstrips. Through the 1950s and 60s, Swiss Vampires practiced a unique role. They would operate from highways. Switzerland's entire defense doctrine assumed that in any conflict, their main air bases would be destroyed in the opening hours. So they designed sections of highway that could be cleared and used as emergency runways, with Vampires hidden in mountain tunnels between sorties. A Swiss pilot who flew Vampires from highway strips in the 1970s, the Vampire was ideal for this mission: short takeoff run, robust landing gear, and simple enough that our ground crews could service it in a highway tunnel with minimal equipment. We practiced these highway operations constantly. Every pilot knew exactly which stretch of Autobahn was his wartime base. As other nations retired their Vampires through the 1970s and 80s, Switzerland kept flying. Not in combat roles by then. The aircraft was far too obsolete, but as trainers, the Vampires were perfect. They taught Swiss pilots the fundamentals of jet flight without the complexity and cost of modern fighters. In 1990, 47 years after the Vampire's first flight and 45 years after the end of World War II, the Swiss Air Force finally retired its last Vampires. The ceremony was held at Dubendorf Air Base near Zurich. Veterans who had flown Vampires in the 1950s stood alongside young pilots who were flying F-5 Tigers and preparing for the FA-18 Hornet. One Swiss officer spoke at the ceremony. His words preserved in the official retirement statement: "The Vampire served Switzerland for nearly 4 decades. It never fired a shot in anger on behalf of our nation, and for that we are grateful. But it stood ready, and it trained the pilots who would maintain our neutrality through the most dangerous years of the Cold War. That is service enough for any aircraft." The de Havilland Vampire never became a household name like the Spitfire or the Mustang. It didn't win a war, it didn't break the sound barrier, but what it did was perhaps more important. It democratized jet aviation. Over 4,200 Vampires were built when you count all variants and all production sources. 32 nations flew them. For air forces from Mexico to India, from Sweden to New Zealand, the Vampire was their entry ticket to the jet age. It was reliable enough to trust, simple enough to maintain, and forgiving enough to learn on. When Captain Eric Brown landed that Sea Vampire on HMS Ocean in December 1945, he proved that jet aircraft had a future beyond land bases. When No. 54 Squadron flew across the Atlantic in 1948, they proved that jets were reliable enough for operational deployments anywhere in the world. When Swiss pilots practiced highway operations through the Cold War, they proved that even smaller nations could field effective jet fighters. The Vampire's strange twin-boom design became iconic. That forward cockpit with its incredible visibility, those twin booms stretching back to support the tail, the bulbous nacelle that earned it the nickname Avocado. It looked like no other fighter, and that turned out to be an advantage. The design was practical, efficient, and eminently buildable. Today, Vampires fly at air shows around the world. Private collectors maintain them, often at considerable expense, because there's something special about this aircraft. It's not the fastest or the most powerful, but it represents a moment of transformation, that brief window between the propeller age and the supersonic age, when jet aviation was still new and anything seemed possible. And when you see a Vampire fly, that distinctive engine note, that graceful profile with its twin booms, you're watching a piece of history. You're watching the jet that changed everything, one flight at a time, one country at a time, one pilot at a time. That's the de Havilland Vampire, powered by a Goblin, flown by heroes, and loved by everyone who ever strapped one on. All right, friends, we're going to wrap it up right there. a vampire powered by a goblin that the Mexicans called an avocado. Honestly, that sounds less like a fighter jet and more like the world's most dangerous guacamole recipe. If you got any questions or there's a particular aircraft you'd like me to cover, drop a comment down below. I read every single one of them. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video. Y'all be safe out there and stay away from haunted avocados.